This wasn't supposed to happen, not in simulations, not in classified briefings, not in the carefully constructed confidence of modern air power doctrine. In a single operational window, a reality unfolded that doesn't fit the narrative the world has been sold for decades. Aircraft engineered to dominate contested skies didn't just face resistance, they vanished from the equation in a way that forces a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What if the foundation itself was flawed? Because this wasn't a story of bad luck, nor a rare tactical misstep that can be quietly corrected and filed away. It felt precise, almost inevitable, like the outcome had been written long before the first system activated or the first engagement began. And that's what makes it so unsettling. If something this significant can occur without warning, without acknowledgement, then the issue isn't just what happened in that moment, but what it reveals about everything leading up to it. For years, the assumption has been clear: technological superiority guarantees control. But what unfolds when that assumption is tested, not in theory, but in reality, and fails to deliver the outcome it promised? The night didn't just challenge expectations, it exposed the possibility that those expectations were built on incomplete truths. And if that's the case, then the real story isn't just about a single event. It's about a system that may have misunderstood its own limits all along. Forget the headlines, because they reduce complexity into noise. What unfolded wasn't chaos. It was structure operating exactly as intended. This wasn't a sudden clash of forces reacting in real time. It was a sequence that had been mapped, tested, and quietly prepared long before the first engagement ever began. The airspace itself wasn't neutral. It had been shaped into something far more dangerous. A layered environment where movement triggered consequences. Entry points weren't just routes, they were predictions. Timing wasn't coincidence, it was anticipated. And instead of a single overwhelming strike, the pressure came in phases: controlled, measured, and adaptive. Each layer didn't just attack, it forced decisions, and those decisions narrowed the options for everything that followed. By the time the situation appeared critical, the outcome was already unfolding along a path that had been engineered in advance. This is the part that doesn't make it into simplified narratives. The engagement didn't begin when the first system activated. It began the moment patterns became predictable. What looked like an operation in motion was, in reality, an operation being guided into a space where every variable had already been studied. And once inside that space, the margin for recovery wasn't just small, it was systematically reduced with every passing second. So the real question isn't how the engagement escalated so quickly, but how long it had been quietly set into motion before anyone realized what they were stepping into. For years, one idea shaped the architecture of modern air power. If you can't be seen, you can't be stopped. Stealth became more than a feature. It became a belief system, a foundation on which strategy, procurement, and confidence were built. But here's the uncomfortable reality that rarely gets stated clearly. Stealth was never invisibility, it was reduction. Reduction of detection range, reduction of tracking quality, reduction of reaction time. And for a long time, that reduction was enough to create dominance. The problem begins when reduction is mistaken for immunity. Because once that assumption takes hold, doctrine stops asking hard questions. It stops exploring edge cases. It stops preparing for the moment when an adversary doesn't try to see you the traditional way, but instead waits, adapts, and engages you on different terms. What this moment exposed isn't that stealth suddenly stopped working, it's that its limitations were always there, just not operationally tested at this level. Stealth aircraft are optimized against specific types of radar, specific engagement models, specific expectations of how threats behave, but change the engagement conditions, compress the distance, shift the detection method, coordinate multiple layers, and the advantage begins to narrow. Not disappear, but narrow enough that timing, positioning, and system coordination start to matter more than raw technological edge. And that's where the real vulnerability emerges. not in the aircraft itself, but in the belief that it could operate under predictable assumptions indefinitely. Because once those assumptions are studied and then systematically exploited, the very strength that defined the platform becomes dependent on conditions that no longer exist. This is the fatal gap between design and reality. Technology evolves, but so does the method used to challenge it. And when one side adapts faster than the other reevaluates, even the most advanced systems begin to operate in environments they were never fully prepared for. So the real issue isn't whether stealth works, it does within its parameters. The issue is whether those parameters were ever meant to hold under sustained, deliberate pressure from an adversary that spent years preparing specifically to test them. Weapons don't win battles, systems do. And what unfolded wasn't the result of a single piece of hardware outperforming expectations, but an entire architecture functioning exactly as it was designed to. It's easy to focus on the visible element, the missile, the interception, the moment of impact, but that's only the final expression of something much deeper. Long before any engagement occurs, the real work is done in how detection, tracking, communication, and timing are integrated into a unified framework. This is where the difference is made, not in isolated capability, but in coordination. A single system can be avoided, suppressed, or overwhelmed. But a network, layered, distributed, and adaptive, changes the rules entirely. Because now, you're not facing one threat, you're moving through an environment where each layer feeds the next. Detection doesn't always mean engagement. Sometimes it means waiting. Tracking doesn't always trigger action. Sometimes it builds a pattern. And when that pattern becomes reliable, the system doesn't react, it executes. That's the shift most analyses miss. The transition from reactive defense to pre-structured response. In this kind of architecture, engagement isn't about catching a target off guard. It's about guiding it into a space where options are already limited. Passive observation at longer ranges minimizes exposure, while active engagement is reserved for the moment of highest probability. Multiple nodes operate with just enough coordination to close gaps without revealing the full picture too early. The result is not overwhelming force, but controlled pressure applied in sequence, forcing decisions, fragmenting responses, and gradually reducing maneuverability. By the time a platform recognizes the extent of the threat, it's no longer dealing with a single system it can counter. It's inside a network that was designed around its expected behavior. And that's the real advantage. Not superior firepower, but superior preparation. Because when a system is built with the patience to observe, the discipline to remain silent, and the precision to act only when conditions are optimal, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be timed correctly. And in that moment, what appears from the outside as a sudden escalation is, in reality, the final phase of a process that began long before the first signal was ever detected. For 2 decades, one side moved forward with confidence, refining systems, expanding capabilities, and reinforcing a belief that its technological edge would remain decisive. At the same time, the other side moved differently, not faster, not louder, but deeper. While one focused on advancing what it already believed worked, the other focused on understanding why it worked and where it didn't. This is the divergence that defines outcomes long before they become visible. Preparation isn't always about building more. It's about learning better. Over years, patterns were observed, missions were studied, behaviors were mapped with a level of patience that doesn't show up in headlines. Routes became predictable. Timing became familiar. Operational habits, once considered strengths, became data points. And slowly, almost invisibly, a picture began to form. On the other side, repetition brought confidence, and confidence reduced friction. Missions that once required caution became routine. Environments once treated as contested began to feel manageable. This is how complacency develops, not through negligence, but through success that goes unchallenged for too long. Because when something works repeatedly, the urgency to question it fades. And that's exactly when it becomes most vulnerable. The real contrast here isn't just technological, it's psychological. One side assumed continuity, the other prepared for disruption. One optimized efficiency, the other studied dependency. And when those two approaches finally intersect, the outcome isn't random. It's the result of accumulated understanding meeting accumulated assumption. What looks like a sudden shift is actually the visible edge of a much longer process. 20 years of preparation doesn't reveal itself gradually. It reveals itself all at once, in a moment where everything that was quietly learned is finally applied. And in that moment, the advantage doesn't belong to the side with more advanced systems. It belongs to the side that understood the system it was facing more completely than the system understood itself. The most revealing part of this moment isn't what was said, it's what wasn't. Because in situations like this, silence is never empty. It's structured, deliberate, and carefully maintained. When events align with expectations, institutions speak quickly, confidently, and in detail. But when reality collides with the narrative those institutions depend on, the response changes. Language becomes cautious. Timelines become unclear. And sometimes there is no language at all, just a controlled absence of it. That absence tells you something critical. The implications are still being measured, not just operationally, but politically, strategically, and psychologically. Because acknowledging what may have happened openly doesn't just explain an event, it forces a reassessment of everything connected to it. Credibility, capability, deterrence, alliances, all of it comes into question at once. And that creates a problem no institution is eager to confront in real time. So instead, the priority shifts from explanation to management. Information is slowed. Details are fragmented. Focus is redirected. Not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it clearly carries consequences that extend far beyond the moment itself. This is where most observers misunderstand silence. They interpret it as uncertainty or lack of knowledge. But often it's the opposite. It's clarity that cannot yet be publicly absorbed, and the longer that silence holds, the more it suggests that what lies beneath it isn't simple, isn't contained, and isn't easily explained without reshaping the narrative that has been built over years. The real question, then, isn't why there's silence, but what that silence is protecting, and how long it can hold before reality forces its way through. This wasn't just a regional moment, it was a global signal, and the world is already responding to it in ways that won't be publicly acknowledged for some time. Because when a single event challenges a foundational assumption, it doesn't stay contained. It forces recalculation everywhere that assumption was built into planning. Military doctrines, procurement strategies, alliance structures, many of them rely on a shared belief in how certain systems perform under pressure. And when that belief is shaken, even slightly, the ripple effect is immediate, even if it remains invisible. Behind closed doors, analysts aren't reacting emotionally. They're running scenarios again, adjusting variables, questioning timelines, and revisiting conclusions that once felt stable. What was previously considered a reliable advantage is now being re-examined as a conditional one. And that distinction changes everything. Because if performance depends on conditions, then the focus shifts from what a system can do to where and when it can actually do it. That uncertainty introduces friction into planning processes that were built on confidence. Nations that structured their defense strategies around certain expectations are now forced to confront a quieter question. What if those expectations were incomplete? This isn't about panic, it's about precision. Recalibration doesn't happen publicly. It happens in quiet rooms, through updated models, revised threat assessments, and subtle shifts in strategic posture. And the most significant changes often leave no immediate trace. But over time, they reshape decisions, investments, and alliances in ways that only become visible much later. That's the nature of a true shockwave. It doesn't explode outward in noise. It travels silently through systems, altering them from within. And by the time the effects are visible on the surface, the underlying calculations have already changed. Power isn't undone by confronting it head-on. It's unraveled by understanding what it depends on and quietly targeting those dependencies. That's the lesson that keeps repeating across history, but is often ignored in moments of dominance. When a system becomes successful, it builds layers of confidence around itself, confidence in its tools, its doctrine, its assumptions about how others will respond. Over time, that confidence hardens into expectation, and expectation narrows the range of possibilities the system prepares for. That's where the opening appears. Because the most effective challenge doesn't try to match strength with strength. It studies behavior, identifies patterns, and waits for consistency to turn into predictability. Once that happens, the contest shifts. It's no longer about overpowering capability. It's about shaping the environment in which that capability operates, limit its options, compress its reaction time, disrupt its assumptions, and even the most advanced system begins to operate under pressure it wasn't designed to handle. This is the shift from symmetrical thinking to asymmetrical execution. Instead of building equivalent platforms, the focus moves to exploiting what those platforms require to function effectively. Clear signals, stable conditions, reliable patterns. Remove or distort those elements, and performance degrades not because the system is weak, but because the environment has been redefined. That's what makes this lesson so uncomfortable. It suggests that dominance is never absolute, only conditional. And once those conditions are understood by an adversary willing to invest time, patience, and discipline, the balance begins to change. Quietly at first, then all at once. This isn't just about one moment, one operation, or one outcome. It's about what becomes possible after a line has been crossed. Because once something is proven under real conditions, it stops being theoretical. It becomes a reference point, a precedent, a signal that others will study, adapt, and build upon. And that's where the real weight of this situation lies. Not in what happened, but in what it enables going forward. The question is no longer whether certain systems can be challenged, but how often, how effectively, and in which environments that challenge can be repeated. Because repetition is what transforms an exception into a pattern, and patterns are what reshape strategy. If assumptions that held for decades can be disrupted in a single window, then every plan built on those assumptions has to be reevaluated. Not publicly, not immediately, but inevitably. And that process has already begun, whether it's acknowledged or not. So the real question isn't what you've been told about this moment, it's what hasn't been said yet, and why. What does it mean for future conflicts where similar conditions can be created? What does it mean for systems that depend on predictability in environments that are becoming increasingly unpredictable? And more importantly, who is already adapting while others are still explaining? Because in moments like this, the advantage doesn't go to the side with the loudest response, it goes to the side that understands the shift first. If you're looking at this as just another isolated headline, you're missing the pattern. But if you're starting to question the assumptions behind it, you're already ahead of most. Drop your analysis below. Not reactions, not narratives, but real breakdowns of what this could mean moving forward. Share this with someone who still thinks dominance is permanent. And if you want to stay ahead of shifts that aren't announced but revealed, stay connected, because the next change won't come with a warning, it will come as a result.